Looks like life finally caught up with you, Evelyn. My brother's laughter filled my tiny apartment through the speaker of my phone. Bankrupt at 67. I guess all those years of trying to do everything your own way finally paid off. Then came another laugh, longer this time, followed by the beep that signaled the end of the voicemail. I sat at my kitchen table and listened to it again. And then again. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of an old refrigerator that came with the place. Outside the window, a gray February sky hung over the parking lot. A pickup truck with a rusted bumper sat in the same spot it had occupied for weeks. Nothing moved. Nothing changed. I pressed play one more time. Richard had always enjoyed being right. At least, that was what he liked to call it. Growing up, he was the older brother who corrected everyone, who reminded people of their mistakes, who somehow found a way to make every conversation about himself. When our parents passed away, he became even worse. Success had made him confident. Money had made him arrogant. And my bankruptcy had given him exactly what he wanted. Proof that he was better than me. I set the phone face down on the table. The screen went dark. For a long moment, I stared at my reflection in the kitchen window. My silver hair needed trimming. The blue sweater I wore had been washed so many times the color had faded around the sleeves. I looked tired, older than 67. But what bothered me most wasn't losing my savings. It wasn't losing the house I had spent 23 years paying off. It wasn't even starting over in a 700-square-foot apartment on the edge of town. It was hearing my own brother celebrate it. The bankruptcy had happened 6 months earlier after a business investment failed. I had trusted the wrong people. The market turned. The numbers stopped working. Everything unraveled faster than I thought possible. Through it all, I kept telling myself that family would still be family. I was wrong. Richard never called to ask if I needed help. He never asked if I was sleeping okay. He never asked how I was managing. Instead, he left voicemails like this one. I stood and carried my coffee mug to the sink. The coffee had gone cold. I poured it out and watched the dark liquid swirl down the drain. Then I glanced at the calendar hanging beside the refrigerator. 3 unpaid utility reminders sat underneath it, held by a magnet shaped like a sunflower. Life had become smaller, simpler. Every dollar mattered. Every trip to the grocery store required a calculator. Every bill brought a little knot of anxiety. Still, I got up every morning. Still, I kept going. That evening, I stopped at a gas station on my way home from a temporary bookkeeping job. I filled my tank with $20 of regular gas and walked inside to buy a bottle of water. Near the register, a display of lottery tickets caught my eye. I almost kept walking. Spending money on luck seemed foolish when money itself was already scarce. But for some reason, I reached into my purse and pulled out a few crumpled bills. 1 ticket, I told the cashier. She smiled and handed it to me. I slipped it into my purse without looking at it again. It felt insignificant, forgettable, just another receipt-sized piece of paper. As I walked back to my car, I had no idea that the ticket resting beside my keys would change everything. More importantly, I had no idea it would reveal who my family really was. The lottery ticket stayed in my purse for 4 days. I forgot about it completely. Life had a way of keeping my attention focused on more immediate problems. Rent was due in 2 weeks. The old sedan I drove had started making a strange noise whenever I turned left. My temporary bookkeeping assignment was ending soon. Winning anything, even a few dollars, felt unlikely. On the 4th evening, I was sitting at my small kitchen table sorting through mail when the ticket slipped out of my purse and landed on the floor. I stared at it for a moment before picking it up. The drawing had already happened. I almost threw it away. Instead, I opened the lottery website on my phone and began comparing the numbers. The first number matched, then the second, then the third. I frowned and checked again. The 4th matched too. My heart began to beat faster. By the time I reached the final number, my hands were trembling. I looked at the ticket, then at the screen, then back at the ticket. Everything matched. Every single number. For several seconds I simply sat there. The refrigerator hummed. A car door slammed somewhere outside. The world continued as if nothing had changed. Yet everything had. I called the lottery office the next morning. The representative was polite and professional. She confirmed the ticket was valid and explained the process. I wrote down every instruction carefully. After hanging up, I sat quietly beside the window. I expected excitement. I expected joy. Instead, I felt cautious. The amount was life-changing. More money than I had ever imagined holding in my lifetime. But alongside relief came another thought. If people learned about this, everything would change. I knew that because I had already seen how differently people treated me when they thought I had nothing. That afternoon, my phone rang. Richard. I watched his name appear on the screen. I let it go to voicemail. A few minutes later, another message arrived. His tone was cheerful this time, almost friendly. He wanted to know how I was doing. He said he had been thinking about me lately. I listened to the message once and deleted it. 6 months earlier, when I was losing my home, he had not called. When I packed boxes alone, he had not called. When I signed bankruptcy papers, he had not called. Now, suddenly, he was interested in my well-being. Something felt different. Not enough to alarm me, just enough to make me pay attention. Over the next week, I completed meetings with financial advisors and attorneys. They encouraged privacy. That advice felt wise. I created a plan. I would not rush. I would not make announcements. I would not tell relatives. I would continue living exactly as before. The same apartment, the same car, the same routine. If people cared about me, they would care about me without knowing what sat quietly in my bank account. A few days later, I met my friend Diane Foster for coffee. She had stood beside me through the worst months of my life. She never asked for anything, never judged me, never treated me like a failure. We sat in a small diner near Main Street. The coffee was average. The pie display looked better than it tasted. Diane listened while I talked about ordinary things. Work, weather, the apartment. She smiled and said, "You seem lighter somehow." I smiled back. Maybe I finally stopped worrying about things I cannot control. She nodded thoughtfully. As we finished our coffee, I realized something important. Losing money had shown me who disappeared. This new secret might show me who remained genuine. And for the first time in a very long while, I was ready to find out. Over the next month, I settled into a routine that looked exactly the same from the outside. Every morning, I woke up at 6:30, made coffee, and watched the sun climb above the apartment buildings across the street. I still clipped coupons. I still compared prices at the grocery store. I still drove the same aging sedan with the worn fabric seats. Nothing about my life suggested that anything had changed. That was intentional. The advisors handling my finances had explained how quickly news could spread. One careless conversation could become 10 conversations. 10 conversations could become 100 opinions. I had no interest in becoming the subject of anyone's curiosity. Keeping my life quiet felt safer. It also revealed things I might have missed otherwise. Richard called more often than before. At first, the conversations seemed harmless. He would ask about my health. He would ask whether I was finding enough work. He would ask if I needed anything. The concerns sounded strange coming from him. For years, our interactions had been limited to holidays and occasional family gatherings. Suddenly, he seemed eager to reconnect. One Sunday afternoon, he invited me to lunch. We met at a restaurant near the river where he and Nancy often went after church. The hostess seated us beside a large window overlooking the water. Richard smiled warmly as I sat down. It was the kind of smile people use when they are trying very hard to appear relaxed. We talked about ordinary things at first. The weather, local news, rising grocery prices. Then his questions became more specific. Was I still working temporary jobs? Had I considered moving somewhere cheaper? Had I spoken with any financial planners lately? I answered carefully. Nothing I said was untrue. I simply left certain details out. He nodded after each answer, but I noticed disappointment flicker across his face. It vanished quickly. Still, I saw it. By the end of lunch, I had learned something valuable. Richard was fishing for information. He just was not finding any. A few days later, Nancy called. That alone surprised me. We had never been particularly close. She spent 20 minutes discussing family events before casually mentioning that Richard worried about me. The comments sounded rehearsed, as though they had discussed it beforehand. After we hung up, I sat quietly in my living room. The afternoon sunlight stretched across the carpet. I thought about the people who had remained present during my hardest months. Diane, my neighbor Mrs. Collins, a former co-worker who occasionally checked in. None of them had asked intrusive questions. None of them seemed interested in my finances. They cared about me, not my circumstances. The difference became impossible to ignore. Then something unexpected happened. Diane invited me to a community fundraiser at the local library. It was a modest event with coffee, homemade desserts, and a silent auction. We spent the evening laughing and talking with people who genuinely enjoyed one another's company. Nobody cared what anyone earned. Nobody measured worth through bank accounts. Driving home afterward, I felt lighter than I had in years. Wealth had entered my life quietly, but perspective was proving even more valuable. And somewhere deep inside, a feeling began to grow. Richard was searching for something. He believed there was information I was hiding. Sooner or later, he would stop pretending otherwise. The first real clue arrived on a rainy Thursday morning. I was leaving the grocery store with 2 small bags when I noticed Richard's SUV parked across the street. At first, I assumed it was a coincidence. Then I saw him sitting behind the wheel, looking in my direction. The moment our eyes met, he started the engine and drove away. It happened so quickly that I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. Almost. Later that afternoon, my phone rang again. Richard sounded unusually cheerful. He asked whether I wanted to join him and Nancy for dinner that weekend. The invitation caught me off guard. During the years when I owned a larger house and hosted family gatherings, they rarely made time for me. After the bankruptcy, invitations disappeared completely. Now they seemed eager to spend time together. I agreed, partly out of curiosity. Saturday evening arrived. Their house looked exactly as I remembered. The same flower beds, the same American flag near the front porch, the same carefully maintained lawn. Nancy greeted me warmly at the door, warmer than she ever had before. During dinner, they asked question after question. Was work going well? Had I made new friends? Did I still plan to stay in my apartment? Had I received any unexpected opportunities lately? The questions sounded casual, but the pattern was impossible to miss. Every road led back to money. Every conversation circled toward finances. I answered politely without revealing anything meaningful. Richard smiled often, yet there was tension behind it, like someone trying to solve a puzzle missing a crucial piece. When dinner ended, Nancy packed leftovers for me to take home. She had never done that before. Driving back to my apartment, I found myself thinking about the voicemail again. The laughter, the certainty in Richard's voice. Back then, he had viewed me as a failure. Nothing more. Now he treated me like someone whose approval mattered. The contrast was difficult to ignore. A week later, Diane and I met for lunch at a small cafe near the public library. As we sat by the window, she studied me carefully. "Something is bothering you," she said. I stirred my iced tea and smiled faintly. "I think someone wants something from me." Diane laughed softly. "That sounds very specific." "Maybe it is." She leaned back in her chair. "The funny thing about difficult times is that they reveal character. Some people disappear when life gets hard. Others suddenly appear when they think circumstances have changed." Her words stayed with me long after lunch ended. That evening, I returned home and found an envelope slipped beneath my apartment door. Inside was a handwritten note from Richard. He wanted to plan a larger family gathering. He said it had been too long since everyone spent time together. The message looked innocent enough, yet something felt off. Family had not been his priority when I needed support. Why now? I placed the note inside a kitchen drawer and closed it. Then I sat quietly beside the window as darkness settled across the parking lot. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed through the night. I realized that Richard was no longer simply curious. He was searching, and whatever he thought he might find, he was becoming increasingly determined to uncover it. The family gathering took place 2 weeks later at Richard and Nancy's house. By then, autumn had begun painting the trees in shades of gold and red. The air carried that crisp feeling that always reminded me how quickly seasons could change. Inside, the house buzzed with conversation. Cousins I had not seen in months suddenly seemed delighted to see me. An uncle who rarely called asked detailed questions about my life. Even distant relatives appeared unusually interested in how I was doing. At first, I wondered if I was imagining it. Then the pattern became impossible to ignore. Everyone wanted to know whether things were improving for me. Everyone wanted updates. Everyone wanted details. I answered politely while revealing almost nothing. Throughout the afternoon, I watched people more than I listened to them. It was amazing what became visible when you stopped talking and simply observed. Some conversations felt genuine. Others felt like interviews disguised as concern. Diane's words returned to me. Difficult times reveal character. Apparently, so did the possibility of opportunity. Later that evening, I found myself standing on the back patio with a paper cup of coffee. The sun was setting behind the neighboring houses. Richard stepped outside and joined me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he sighed heavily. "Business has been stressful lately," he said. I nodded. He had always enjoyed discussing his successes. Hearing him mention problems felt unusual. "The economy has been unpredictable," he continued. Some investments are not performing the way they should. I listened quietly. He glanced toward me before looking away. You know how these things go. Actually, I did. I knew exactly how they went. I had lived through the consequences. Yet something about his tone felt different. Less confident. Less certain. For years, Richard carried himself like a man who believed setbacks happened only to other people. Now I sensed cracks beneath the surface. Over the following month, those cracks became harder to hide. Nancy called more frequently. Richard texted more often. Invitations arrived regularly. Lunches, dinners, family events. Their attention felt almost relentless. One evening, while organizing paperwork at home, I received a call from a former acquaintance who still worked in local banking. During casual conversation, he mentioned hearing that Richard's latest commercial property investment was struggling. The comment lasted only a few seconds before the discussion moved on, yet it explained a great deal. Suddenly, many recent interactions made sense. The questions, the invitations, the sudden warmth. Richard was facing uncertainty. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, he was looking for security. The irony was difficult to miss. Years earlier, when uncertainty entered my life, he had laughed. Now uncertainty was knocking on his door. A few days later, he invited me to another dinner. This time, his voice carried a level of urgency I had not heard before. As I ended the call, I sat quietly at my kitchen table. The same table where I had once listened to that voicemail. The same apartment. The same life on the surface. Yet beneath everything, the balance was shifting. Richard did not know it yet, but he was getting closer to revealing exactly why he had suddenly become so interested in family. The next dinner invitation arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. Richard called personally instead of sending a text. His voice sounded friendly, but there was something underneath it now. A tension he could not completely hide. He asked whether I could come over Friday evening. He said he wanted to. Talk about family. That phrase alone made me smile after the call ended. For most of our adult lives, Richard only mentioned family when it benefited him somehow. Still, I accepted. Friday arrived cold and windy. The trees along his street had lost most of their leaves, leaving bare branches stretching across the gray sky. Nancy greeted me warmly when I arrived. Almost too warmly. During dinner, they asked about my apartment, my work, and my plans for the future. Then Richard set down his fork and leaned back in his chair. Have you ever thought about making a fresh start somewhere else? He asked. Maybe, I replied. Why? He shrugged casually. No reason, just curious. But his eyes stayed fixed on me, watching, measuring, waiting. The conversation drifted elsewhere, yet I noticed both of them exchanging occasional glances. By the time dessert arrived, I felt certain they were building towards something. It finally happened as Nancy poured coffee. Richard cleared his throat. I have been dealing with some challenges lately, he said. I nodded but remained silent. He continued. A few business projects have not gone the way I expected. That was the closest I had ever heard him come to admitting failure. Normally, every investment became a success story. Every decision became proof of his intelligence. Tonight was different. Things will work out, I said politely. He smiled. I hope so. Then he looked directly at me. Sometimes family has to support each other through difficult periods. The sentence hung in the air. I took a sip of coffee and said nothing. A few seconds passed before Nancy changed the subject. On the drive home, I replayed the conversation in my mind. The message had been subtle, but it was there. Richard was testing the waters, looking for signs, looking for opportunities, looking for help. Meanwhile, I continued living exactly as before. I still drove the same car. I still shopped at the same stores. I still lived in the same apartment. The more ordinary my life appeared, the more frustrated Richard seemed to become. A week later, Diane and I met at the diner near Main Street. As we shared lunch, I told her about the recent conversations. She listened carefully. Do you think he suspects anything? She asked. I think he suspects there is something he does not know. Diane smiled. People like that cannot stand unanswered questions. She was right. The following days brought even more calls, more invitations, more concern, yet none of it felt genuine. It felt strategic, like a fisherman casting line after line into the water, hoping eventually to get a bite. Then one afternoon, something unexpected happened. A mutual acquaintance called me after running into Richard at a local business event. During their conversation, Richard had apparently mentioned that he was dealing with serious financial pressure and searching for solutions. When the call ended, I I sat quietly beside my window and watched headlights move through the parking lot below. For the first time, the pieces fit together perfectly. Richard was not rebuilding a relationship. He was preparing a request. The only question remaining was how far he was willing to go once he finally made it. The request finally came 3 weeks before Christmas. By then, the town had decorated Main Street with lights and wreaths. Store windows glowed in the early evenings. Holiday music played everywhere. Yet beneath the cheerful atmosphere, I could feel something building. Richard called on a Monday afternoon and asked whether I could meet him for coffee. His voice sounded unusually serious. Not dramatic, just tired. We met at a cafe near the courthouse. He arrived 10 minutes early. That alone told me something was different. Richard had spent most of his life making other people wait. After we ordered our drinks, he stared into his coffee for several moments before speaking. "I have had a rough year," he said quietly. I nodded. He continued. "A few projects went sideways. One thing led to another. Now I am trying to keep everything together." For once, there was no confidence in his voice. No performance, just concern. I listened without interrupting. He explained that several investments had underperformed. Financing had become more complicated. Expenses were piling up faster than expected. As he talked, I noticed something that surprised me. He genuinely seemed worried. Not because he had become poor, not because he was facing bankruptcy, but because he was experiencing uncertainty. The same uncertainty he once mocked in me. Finally, he looked up. "Family is important during times like this." There it was, the sentence I had been expecting for months. I took a slow sip of coffee and waited. "I have been thinking a lot about how we have drifted apart," he said. "Maybe we should be helping each other more." The words sounded noble, almost heartfelt, yet the timing was impossible to ignore. Where had this wisdom been when I was packing boxes after losing my house? Where had it been when I sat alone signing legal documents that changed my future? I remembered every unanswered call, every ignored message, every moment when support could have mattered. Most of all, I remembered the voicemail, the laughter, the satisfaction in his voice. Richard kept talking, but part of my attention drifted elsewhere. Back to that afternoon, back to sitting alone at my kitchen table, back to realizing exactly how little compassion remained beneath his polished image. When he finished speaking, silence settled between us. The cafe was busy. Dishes clattered. Espresso machines hissed. People laughed at nearby tables. Yet our corner felt strangely quiet. "I am sorry things have been difficult," I said sincerely. And I meant it. I did not enjoy seeing anyone struggle. Not even Richard. He seemed relieved by my response. Perhaps he interpreted kindness as weakness. Perhaps he believed sympathy would eventually become financial support. Whatever the reason, his shoulders relaxed. We talked a little longer before leaving. As we stood in the parking lot, he placed a hand on my shoulder. "I am glad we are reconnecting," he said. I smiled politely. Then I drove home. That evening, I sat by my apartment window watching snow begin to fall. Tiny flakes drifted through the glow of the parking lot lights. My phone rested on the table beside me. Inside it remained a saved voicemail that I had never deleted. I had not listened to it in months. Yet I knew every word by heart. And for the first time, I became certain that before this story ended, Richard was going to hear it again. Christmas arrived with a fresh layer of snow covering the town. Streets glowed with lights. Storefronts displayed wreaths and decorations. Families gathered for celebrations. Richard decided to host a large holiday dinner and made certain everyone knew about it. He called personally to invite me. Nancy followed up with a text message. Several relatives mentioned how excited they were that the family would finally be together again. I accepted the invitation. Part of me knew exactly why it was happening. Another part wanted to see how far things would go. The evening of the dinner, Richard's house was filled with people. Coats lined the hallway. Conversations drifted from room to room. The smell of roasted turkey and baked desserts filled the air. At first, everything seemed normal. Relatives exchanged gifts. Children played games in the living room. Laughter echoed through the house. Yet beneath the surface, I sensed anticipation. Richard watched me more closely than anyone else. Every time I entered a room, his attention followed. During dinner, he raised a glass and offered a toast about family, second chances, and supporting one another through difficult times. Several people nodded approvingly. I remained quiet. After the meal, everyone moved into the family room for coffee and dessert. That was when Richard finally made his move. He stood near the fireplace and cleared his throat. The room gradually became silent. "There is something I would like to talk about," he said. His expression carried a carefully practiced mixture of humility and concern. He explained that he had faced unexpected business challenges. He described financial pressure and difficult decisions. Then he shifted the conversation toward family loyalty. "At times like this," he said, "we learn who truly cares about us." The words sounded familiar, almost rehearsed. Several relatives murmured their agreement. Then Richard looked directly at me. "I know we have had our differences over the years, Evelyn, but family should help family." The room became very quiet. Every eye turned toward me. I could almost feel the expectation building. Richard continued speaking about forgiveness and moving forward. He talked about rebuilding relationships. He talked about support. He talked about compassion. Listening to him felt surreal. Months earlier, he had celebrated my downfall. Now he was presenting himself as a champion of family unity. When he finally finished, silence settled across the room. I set down my coffee cup and reached into my purse. Richard's face brightened slightly. He seemed convinced I was about to offer help. Instead, I took out my phone. "Before we continue," I said calmly, "there is something I think everyone should hear." Confusion crossed several faces. Richard frowned. I opened an audio file that had remained untouched for months. The room stayed silent as I pressed play. His voice filled the room immediately. Clear, unmistakable. The laughter came first, then the comments about my bankruptcy, then the satisfaction, then the ridicule. Nobody spoke while the recording played. Nobody moved. When it ended, the silence felt heavier than before. Richard stared at the floor. Nancy looked stunned. A few relatives exchanged uncomfortable glances. Others simply sat frozen. For the first time all evening, there was no speech about family, no discussion about support, no carefully prepared message. Only the sound of truth hanging in the room. I slipped the phone back into my purse and waited. Because now everyone had finally heard the part of the story that Richard had hoped would remain hidden. For several long seconds, nobody said anything. The only sound in the room came from the crackling fireplace and the faint hum of the heating system. Richard remained frozen in his chair. The confidence that had filled his voice earlier was gone. Several relatives looked at him, waiting for an explanation that never came. Nancy lowered her eyes. An uncle quietly set down his coffee cup. The atmosphere had changed completely. Nobody was interested in speeches about family anymore. The facts were sitting in the room with us. Eventually, Richard cleared his throat. "Evelyn, I was upset back then," he said. "I did not mean it the way it sounded." I nodded slowly. "You laughed at my bankruptcy," I replied. My voice remained calm. "You knew I had lost my home. You knew I was struggling. And you laughed." He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. There was nothing left to explain. The recording had done all the talking for him. One of my cousins shook her head quietly. Another relative looked away. Nobody seemed angry. They simply seemed disappointed. That was somehow more powerful. Richard tried once more. He spoke about stress. He spoke about mistakes. He spoke about saying things he regretted. I listened respectfully. Then I reached into my purse again. This time several people watched curiously. I removed a folded document and placed it on the coffee table. "There is one more thing everyone should know," I said. Richard stared at me. So did everyone else. I took a breath. Several months ago, I received some unexpected good news. The room became silent again. I won a lottery prize. A few people blinked in surprise. Nancy looked stunned. Richard's expression changed instantly. For a moment, pure disbelief crossed his face. Then came realization. Suddenly, many things must have made sense to him. The questions, the suspicions, the feeling that something was different. I continued speaking before anyone could interrupt. The money changed my circumstances. It paid for security. It gave me options. It gave me peace of mind. Nobody spoke, but it also taught me something important. I looked directly at Richard. Money does not reveal character. Difficult times reveal character. His face turned pale. When I lost everything, I learned who genuinely cared about me. I learned who checked on me. I learned who offered kindness when there was nothing to gain. Diane's friendship, the concern of neighbors, the support of ordinary people passed through my mind. And when life improved, I learned who suddenly became interested again. Richard lowered his eyes. Then came the question everyone expected. Was I going to help him? Was I going to rescue him from the problems he had described? I already knew my answer. "I wish you well," I said. "I truly do. But I am not responsible for solving your financial problems." Nobody argued. Nobody challenged me. Deep down, everyone understood. This was not revenge. It was a boundary. There is a difference. A few minutes later, I gathered my coat and prepared to leave. Outside, snowflakes drifted gently beneath the streetlights. The cold air felt fresh against my face. As I walked toward my car, I realized something unexpected. Winning money had improved my life. But the real gift was clarity. I no longer wondered who valued me. I no longer questioned where I stood with people. The answers had become obvious. I started the engine and watched snow settle across the windshield. Then I drove home to my small apartment, feeling lighter than I had in years. Richard lost an opportunity that night. I gained something far more valuable: peace.